Easter morning in a quiet town. A devoted churchgoer arrives early and never makes it out alive. What she saw inside the sanctuary wasn't a miracle. It was a secret worth killing for. This is the true story of the Easter morning murder. They say small towns keep their secrets buried beneath their quiet streets. But on Easter Sunday morning in Willowdale, one secret clawed its way to the surface. Living Rivers Fellowship sat on the corner of Main and Chapel Street, its white steeple piercing the blue spring sky like a blade. It had stood there for over 70 years, long enough for generations to pass through its doors with baptisms, weddings, and funerals. Long enough for people to trust that nothing could ever go wrong there. Reverend Thomas Albright had pastored the church for 15 of those years. He was the kind of man everyone trusted, broad-shouldered, calm-voiced, the kind of preacher who remembered your children's names and your mother's birthday. He had served in the Navy, led prison ministries, and counseled couples through affairs and addiction. He was not just respected, he was revered. But reverence is often built on what people don't see. The Easter Vigil the night before had drawn the largest crowd the church had seen since Christmas. Dozens of families filled the pews. Candles lit the sanctuary in a soft, golden glow. Scripture was read, hymns sung, prayers offered. Reverend Albright had delivered a moving message about resurrection and forgiveness. At 11:56 p.m., he dismissed the congregation. "Go home in peace," he said. "Come back with joy. The tomb is empty, and so are our hearts, ready to be filled." One by one, the congregation filtered out. A few lingered behind to speak with him. That wasn't unusual. Some needed prayers. Others asked questions about baptism or marriage. He met them all with a tired but patient smile. It was nearly 1 a.m. before the last person left. What no one noticed, what no one ever noticed, was that Naomi Caldwell, the choir director, had never left. She'd stayed behind quietly, slipping into the pastor's study while the sanctuary emptied. It wasn't her first time doing so. Their affair had begun 6 months ago, a slow descent paved with prayer meetings and shared confessions. Naomi was elegant, composed, with a voice that carried like a bell when she sang. She was also divorced, lonely, and very much in love with a man she could never truly have. By 1:30 a.m., the church was dark except for the warm light spilling from under the study door. Inside, Thomas and Naomi sat close on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand on her thigh. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered. "That's what you said last time," she replied, fingers tracing the edge of his collar. He stood and paced the room. "If anyone finds out, no one will. They never do." It wasn't supposed to last long, just a few moments of intimacy. She would sneak out before dawn. But minutes stretched. Time got away from them, and somewhere around 3:45 a.m., they both dozed off. At 4:10 a.m., the side door of the church creaked open. Agnes Morrow was 79, spry for her age, and as faithful as they came. She had been a member of Living Rivers since 1965. She taught Sunday school, led prayer chains, and made casseroles for every funeral reception. She never missed an Easter. But this year, she felt something stir her awake in the pre-dawn dark, a need to pray, alone, before the celebration began. She arrived with a shawl around her shoulders and a thermos of tea in hand. The church was unlocked, normal for Easter. Reverend Albright often stayed the night. Agnes walked in silently, grateful for the stillness. She made her way to the front pew and knelt. That's when she heard it, a muffled voice, a laugh. She followed it, confused, until she reached the hallway that led to the pastor's study. The door was slightly ajar. Light pooled onto the floor. She peeked in. What she saw froze her in place. Reverend Albright, Naomi Caldwell, entwined, half-dressed. Agnes let out a quiet gasp and turned quickly to leave, her heart thudding. But the sound of the door creaking shut behind her caught Thomas's attention. He looked up, saw the shadow retreating down the hallway, and felt the bottom drop out of his world. He jumped to his feet. Naomi followed. Agnes had made it to the back of the sanctuary when he caught up with her. "Agnes, please," he said, his voice low but urgent. She turned to face him, pale and trembling. "What have you done?" she whispered. Naomi stepped up beside him. "We didn't mean." She wasn't supposed to see. Agnes shook her head. "This is God's house. You desecrated it." "She'll tell," Naomi said softly, panic in her eyes. Agnes took a step back. "You need to confess. Both of you." Thomas moved forward, hands up. "Agnes, please. Let's just talk." But Agnes was already reaching into her purse. For a phone? For her rosary? They'd never know. What happened next happened quickly. A scuffle. A fall. A stifled scream. When it was over, Agnes lay motionless on the floor of the old vestry room. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders. Her thermos had rolled across the tile. Naomi stood in shock. "Oh my God! Is she?" Thomas knelt beside the body, felt for a pulse. Nothing. She was going to ruin everything, Naomi whispered. Thomas stared at the stillness before him. He knew what had to happen next. By 5 a.m., the body was hidden in the old supply room behind the organ. A mop bucket was placed near her. Her purse was zipped shut. The lights were turned off. They cleaned the study, straightened their clothes, whispered one last prayer. At 6:45 a.m., Lena, the custodian, arrived to unlock the sanctuary, and the Easter service went on. But not for long. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled colors across the sanctuary floor. The choir gathered near the front, rehearsing softly. Naomi stood among them, her voice steady, her face unreadable. Not a hair out of place. Not a flicker of emotion betrayed the storm that had raged just hours earlier. Thomas stood at the pulpit, flipping slowly through his sermon notes. Though he already knew every word, his mind wasn't on the paper. It was on the still body hidden behind the organ, on the sound Agnes made as she fell, on the prayer he mumbled afterward, more plea than repentance. He could still feel the heat of her blood, even though his hands had been scrubbed so raw they stung with every movement. He looked up now and then, watching the congregation filter in. Familiar faces, warm smiles, hugs exchanged. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to suggest anyone knew what had happened before the sun rose. The choir director, the reverend, the murderers, they stood in plain sight. At precisely 8 o'clock, the Easter service began. Naomi led the choir through "Christ the Lord is risen today," her voice soaring above the harmonies. She looked serene, radiant even. The congregation watched her in admiration. None could guess that her knees had buckled in terror just hours earlier, her sobs muffled against the chapel wall. Thomas stepped forward, voice composed, tone perfect. He prayed for the lost and the grieving, for the broken and the searching. He prayed for redemption, for forgiveness. But his eyes avoided the corner near the organ, avoided Naomi's face, avoided anything that might pull the mask away. He began his sermon, titled "The Stone Rolled Away." The irony wasn't lost on him. As he spoke of new life and renewal, he wondered if Agnes's eyes were still open behind that closet door. He pictured the shawl slipping from her shoulders, the thermos rolling across the floor, the way her body crumpled when she fell. Halfway through the sermon, he caught Mary Jenkins looking around, then leaning toward her daughter. "Isn't it odd Agnes isn't here?" Mary whispered, "She's never missed an Easter." Her daughter shrugged, distracted by a child squirming. Lena, the church custodian, overheard it. She made a mental note to check on Agnes after service, assuming the elderly woman had overslept or fallen ill. The service went on, hymn after hymn, handshake after handshake. Naomi avoided Thomas's gaze, chatting briefly with members after the closing prayer, hugging a little girl from the children's choir. Thomas stood by the front door, shaking hands, saying all the right things. "Happy Easter. He is risen indeed. God bless you." Inside, he was fracturing. By 10:15 a.m., the sanctuary was mostly empty again. Children ran laughing across the lawn, searching for colored eggs tucked into hedges. Naomi disappeared into the office. Thomas lingered in the fellowship hall, unsure where to go. And then came the scream, pierced the joyful chatter outside like a blade. Lena had gone to fetch a mop to clean up a spill in the children's room. She opened the supply closet behind the organ and stepped back, hands flying to her mouth. Agnes lay on the floor, shawl tangled around one arm, her eyes half open, her purse tipped over beside her. Her thermos was still resting against the wall. Her skin was pale, still cold. By 10:30, police had arrived. Tape cordoned off the back of the sanctuary. The egg hunt came to an abrupt end. Thomas stood in silence, watching it all unfold. The resurrection sermon was already forgotten. Judgment had begun. Detective Eliza Hart stepped into the sanctuary with the quiet authority of someone used to walking into holy places under unholy circumstances. She was small in stature but moved with precision, eyes scanning everything. The pattern of the pews, the subtle trail of footprints near the organ, the way Thomas looked like a man waiting to be swallowed whole by the earth. Lena stood beside the entrance, pale and shaking, pointing toward the organ loft. She was in the closet. I just needed a mop. I didn't even. Eliza nodded gently, her gloved hand guiding Lena to a nearby pew. Take a seat, ma'am. We'll take it from here. The forensic team moved in, silent and professional. Cameras flashed. Evidence bags rustled. Eliza crouched by Agnes's body, examining the position of her limbs, the light bruising on her temple. Her eyes narrowed at the marks, barely visible but there. She looked like she had fallen, but something about the angle was wrong. Too clean, too deliberate. Natural causes? Asked Officer Kinsey, standing over her shoulder. Possibly, but we don't guess. We wait, Eliza replied. Her tone was calm, but her instincts whispered otherwise. The church was locked down. No one allowed to leave. Congregants who hadn't left before the scream were gathered in the fellowship hall, murmuring among themselves. Some cried, others prayed. A few simply stared into space, stunned. Eliza requested to speak with the Reverend first. Thomas sat alone in the church office, his collar slightly crooked, hands clasped together on the desk in front of him. He looked like a man holding a vigil for his own soul. Reverend Thomas? Eliza said as she entered. I'm Detective Hart. I understand this is a shock. Yes, he said, his voice dry. Agnes. She was a pillar of this church. Did you see her last night? He hesitated. No, I assumed she went home after the vigil. Do you often stay late? He looked up then, just briefly. I do. I find peace here when everyone else has gone. Was anyone else with you? Another pause. No, just me. Eliza studied him for a long moment. And the door to the supply closet? Is it usually locked? Sometimes. Not always. Do you have the only key? No. The staff share access. Lena does. The choir director. A few others. Eliza nodded and made a note. Outside the office, Naomi stood frozen near the side hall, pretending to scroll through her phone. She looked up just as Eliza stepped out. "Naomi Graves?" Naomi blinked, putting on a faint smile. "Yes, ma'am. Mind if we talk?" Naomi followed her into a side room. The detective noticed how she rubbed her arms, how her eyes darted. She was nervous, too nervous for someone who'd merely shown up to sing. "How long have you been part of this church?" 5 years, Naomi said. "I joined the choir after my divorce. Reverend Thomas. He was very supportive." Eliza noted the shift in her voice when she said his name. "And last night? Were you here after the vigil?" Naomi's breath caught. She shook her head too quickly. "No, I left early. I wasn't feeling well." The lie hit the air like incense, cloying and too sweet. Eliza leaned in slightly. "Anyone see you leave?" I think so. Maybe one of the ushers. Or Mrs. Pendle." Eliza nodded slowly, her mind already parsing holes in the story. "Thank you, Naomi. Please don't leave just yet." When she stepped outside, Eliza exhaled, letting her eyes drift over the quiet town square beyond the church. Something had happened in that sanctuary, something much darker than an old woman collapsing, and she could feel it, like a wrong note in a familiar hymn. Agnes hadn't just fallen, she had been silenced, and someone in that church still had blood on their hands. By Monday morning, the news had spread through Silverwood like a storm on a still lake. "Church elder found dead after Easter service," read the headlines. Local radio hosts handled it delicately, but the undercurrent was the same in every whisper. Something felt off. Detective Eliza Hart returned to the church just after sunrise. The building, now cordoned off with yellow tape, sat quiet and brooding under the weight of suspicion. Her first stop was the medical examiner's office. The preliminary autopsy had come in overnight. Blunt force trauma to the side of the head, not consistent with a typical fall. The blow had been delivered with intent. Eliza's gut clenched. Agnes Thorne had been murdered, and the circle of suspects was small. Back at the precinct, Eliza compiled her list. Reverend Thomas, Naomi Graves, Lena the custodian, and perhaps one or two others who might have had access to the church after hours. But it was the preacher and the choir director who raised her suspicions the most. The inconsistencies were there. Small things, body language, evasive answers, the invisible thread between guilt and self-preservation. She drove to Naomi's apartment that afternoon. The young woman answered the door wrapped in a faded cardigan, her hair tied back. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "I already said everything I knew," she said, barely above a whisper. Eliza stepped in, glancing around. The apartment was modest but tidy. A framed photo on the wall showed Naomi singing with the choir. Next to it, tucked behind a candle, was a picture of her and Thomas at a church picnic. "I just have a few follow-up questions," Eliza said gently. "Mind if I sit?" Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "I understand you said you left early Saturday night." "I did," Naomi said quickly. "I wasn't feeling well. And you mentioned someone might have seen you?" Naomi paused. "I don't know anymore. I think I was just confused." Eliza tilted her head. "It's okay to be confused. But here's the thing. We pulled the security footage from the neighboring bank across the street. Their cameras face the church parking lot. We didn't see you leave when you said you did." Naomi stiffened. "And what's more," Eliza continued, "we didn't see Agnes arrive Sunday morning either, which means she never left after the vigil. She died sometime between midnight and sunrise. You sure you want to stick to your story?" Naomi's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Did you stay behind with Reverend Thomas?" Eliza asked gently. Was it the two of you together? Tears welled up in Naomi's eyes. Her fingers dug into her sleeves. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she whispered. What wasn't? It wasn't supposed to be like that. We were going to end it. It was a mistake. Naomi, Eliza said, voice low. What did you see that night? Naomi closed her eyes, and for a moment, Eliza thought she might bolt. But then the words came, halting and broken. She walked in on us. Agnes. She must have come in through the side door. We didn't hear her until she was already standing there, just staring. Eliza didn't interrupt. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there. And then she said, "How could you?" Naomi's voice cracked. She looked at him like he'd killed God himself. What happened next? Naomi wiped her face. She said she'd have to tell the elders, that it wasn't just a sin, it was betrayal. She turned to leave, but Thomas, he just snapped. He chased after her, tried to stop her. I thought he just wanted to explain, but she screamed, loud, said his name. And then, she broke off, shuddering. I saw him push her. She hit her head on the closet door frame. It happened so fast. And then she was just on the ground. Eliza let the silence stretch for a moment. Did he ask for your help hiding her? Naomi nodded slowly. He panicked. We both did. He said it couldn't come out. Said it would destroy everything. His reputation, the church, everything he'd built. Did you believe him? Naomi looked up, guilt flooding her expression. I wanted to, but she was still breathing when we put her in the closet. Eliza's stomach turned, but her face didn't move. You left her there? Naomi nodded, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. He said she was gone. I didn't know what to do. Eliza stood, her tone changing. Naomi Graves, I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction of justice and complicity in the death of Agnes Thorne. Naomi didn't resist. As the cuffs clicked shut, she whispered, He'll lie to you. He'll make you believe he's innocent. But he's not. He never was. By evening, Eliza was back at the church. Reverend Thomas was in his office, lights off, staring at an open Bible. He didn't flinch when the door opened. We found Agnes's blood on your jacket, Eliza said, stepping in. And Naomi told us everything. Thomas didn't speak. She said she saw you push her, that you left her to die. Still nothing. I need you to come with me, Reverend. He finally looked up. Do you believe in redemption, detective? I believe in justice, she said. As he stood, adjusting his collar one last time, the sanctuary bell rang softly in the distance. An echo of a faith that had once promised grace, now twisted by the very hands sworn to uphold it. The courthouse was packed. Not with journalists. Silverwood wasn't that kind of town, but with faces familiar and devastated. Elders from the church. Quiet, teary-eyed parishioners. A few sat with arms crossed in disbelief. Others stared straight ahead as if trying to wake from a collective nightmare. Reverend Thomas Caldwell, a man once revered as the spiritual cornerstone of the community, now stood at the defense table in a gray suit with hands folded before him and eyes hollow. Naomi Graves sat just feet away, thinner now, her hair pulled back in a tight, utilitarian bun. She hadn't spoken to Thomas since the day of their arrest. In the weeks that followed, she'd accepted a plea deal, full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. The DA believed her testimony was the only way to unravel the exact sequence of events, what had happened in those deadly early hours of Easter morning. Detective Eliza Hart sat behind the prosecution, her presence unnoticed by many, but her work had built the case brick by brick. There had been no security footage from inside the church, No fingerprints that clearly proved intent. Just blood, fabric fibers, and Naomi's confession. It was the latter that silenced the room. "I wish I could say I tried to stop him," Naomi said from the stand. "I wish I could say I ran to Agnes and helped her. But I didn't. I stood there. I let it happen." The courtroom remained still. She caught us in an embrace. Something more. It wasn't the first time, but we'd always been careful. She was just there, watching. She said we'd betrayed the church, that we weren't just sinners but liars. She said she couldn't stay silent. Naomi paused, voice shaking. Thomas begged her not to tell, said it would ruin everything. But she wouldn't back down. She turned to leave, and he reached for her. She fell. I think he just meant to stop her. I don't think he meant to kill her." But when she hit the floor, she couldn't finish. The defense argued it was an accident, that Agnes had startled them and in the panic, slipped and struck her head, that Thomas had wanted to call for help but panicked, that he was afraid, not of guilt, but of what the town would say, the shame, the disgrace. But intent had already stained the facts. Agnes had been left to die, and then hidden, lied about, buried behind the rituals of Easter morning, behind sermons and hymns, behind the shaking of hands and the joyful cries of children on the lawn. Eliza's report had detailed every inconsistency. Thomas had told 3 different stories to 3 different officers. Naomi's prints had been found on Agnes's shawl. The supply closet latch had been bent from the inside, as though someone had tried to push it closed in haste. By Thursday, the verdict came down. Guilty, on charges of manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. Naomi's reduced sentence would be served in a women's correctional facility 2 counties over. Thomas would face up to 25 years. The town was stunned into a mourning deeper than even Agnes's death had inspired. Not just because a beloved woman had died, but because the hands that had folded so often in prayer had also carried out deception. The church closed for 2 months. No services, no vigils, just silence, a quiet reckoning. When it reopened, it was under the guidance of a visiting minister. The sanctuary was repainted. The organ was moved, and Agnes's favorite pew, the second from the front on the left, was left empty during every service for a full year. A shawl was draped gently across the cushion, her thermos placed beneath it. Detective Eliza Hart visited once, months later. She stood at the back, unnoticed, listening to the congregation sing the very hymn that had once hidden a terrible truth. "Christ the Lord is risen today." She didn't sing. She just watched. Somehow they still sang with hope. But she knew what it cost to keep faith when the altar had once been drenched in silence and blood. The quiet of Silverwood had been restored, or so it seemed. Life went on, though the town would never be quite the same. People went back to their routines, their gossip, their church services. But there was always a shadow cast over the town square. A murmur in the streets when names like Reverend Thomas or Naomi Graves were spoken. It was as though the very air held the weight of their secrets, the dust of their sins still clinging to the corners. Detective Eliza Hart had done what she could to put the case behind her. She didn't know why she'd stayed. Perhaps it was the odd feeling she had about the way things had ended. Too neat, too packaged for her liking. She couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was still missing, something they hadn't seen. 2 years passed since the trial, and she'd moved on to other cases. But Silverwood had a way of pulling her back. She'd find herself driving through, the town's familiarity like a pull at her chest, the faintest itch. One late afternoon, as autumn began to paint the trees, she found herself outside the old church again, the sun dipping low behind the bell tower. She parked her car on the street and stared at the building. The new minister, a kind but quiet man, had been holding services for months. Eliza hadn't attended. She wasn't sure she could. But today, something urged her to go in. As she walked up the front steps, she noticed something. It was small, almost imperceptible, but there. A figure standing in the shadow of the bell tower. A woman, watching. Eliza's pulse quickened. She had learned to trust her instincts, and her gut was telling her that something wasn't right. The woman turned as if sensing Eliza's gaze, and their eyes met. It was Naomi Graves. Her appearance had changed. She was no longer the young, nervous woman who had cried in the courtroom. Time had hardened her features. Her eyes, once so filled with fear, now held something else. Something colder, something deeper. "Eliza Hart," Naomi called out, her voice carrying across the quiet yard. "You're here. I wasn't expecting to see you here," Eliza replied, her mind racing. Naomi had been serving her time. Eliza had assumed she'd been transferred out of state by now. Naomi stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "I'm free now. It's over. They let me out early for good behavior." Eliza studied her for a moment. "I'm glad to see you're doing well. I never thought you'd come back here." "I never thought I would either," Naomi said softly, her voice distant. "But there's something I need to tell you." Eliza felt her heart skip. She had no idea what Naomi might say, but her instincts told her that whatever was coming wasn't going to be simple. "What is it?" Eliza asked carefully. Naomi took a deep breath and glanced up at the church. "You know how people say you can't escape your past? Well, I've tried. I've tried so hard, Eliza. But it haunts me, and I'm afraid it's still here. Still in that church." Eliza didn't speak, watching Naomi closely as she continued. "It's not just the murder," Naomi whispered. "It's everything that happened after. The way we covered it up. The way I covered it up." Eliza's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. "What are you saying, Naomi?" Naomi turned to face her fully now. "It wasn't just the two of us. There was someone else. Someone who helped us." Eliza froze. "Who?" Naomi's gaze flicked nervously toward the church doors. She lowered her voice. "The new minister. The one who replaced Thomas." Eliza's pulse spiked. The new minister. She had heard nothing but good things about him. A quiet man who'd come from a larger city, looking for a fresh start. But Eliza had learned to distrust neat stories. And this one, she realized, was far from it. "Are you sure about this?" Eliza asked, her voice tight. Naomi nodded, her face pale. "I didn't understand it at the time. I thought I was just trying to survive. But he was there, after we left the church. He was there when I got out of prison. Why didn't you tell me this before?" Eliza asked, frustration and disbelief creeping into her voice. Naomi swallowed, looking guilty. "I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want to believe it myself. But now I know the truth. Thomas wasn't the only one who needed to be protected." Eliza's mind raced. Her thoughts darted back to every conversation she'd had with Thomas. The lies, the inconsistencies. But this was something new, something dangerous. "What do you want from me?" Eliza asked, her voice low. Naomi's eyes locked on hers, and there was something haunting about the look in them. "I want you to know everything, before it's too late, before it's too late." The words echoed in Eliza's mind, the warning clear. "Come with me," Naomi whispered. "I'll show you." With a reluctant nod, Eliza followed Naomi into the church. As they stepped inside, the silence enveloped them. The walls, once filled with songs of hope, now seemed cold and empty. Naomi led her down the familiar hallways, past the pulpit and toward the old office where Thomas had once stood. "Eliza," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's still here. The air seemed to thicken as they reached the back of the office. Naomi pushed open the door, and there, in the corner, was the old wooden box. It had always been a mystery, the church's locked storage. No one had ever thought to investigate it, not after everything that had happened. But now, Naomi's trembling hands opened it. Inside, crumpled pages, a journal, and something else. A photograph of the new minister, his face blurred with a sickening smile. Naomi's hands shook as she turned the pages. The entries were scribbled in a hurried, frenzied script. "Where's Thomas?" Eliza asked, her throat tightening. Naomi's eyes met hers, filled with terror. "He's gone, but someone else has taken his place." And with those words, the true horror of what had happened in the church began to unfold.